The unexpected encounter. The early morning sunlight poured through the large glass panels of the bustling airport terminal, painting the floor with streaks of warm golden light. The soft hum of activity filled the air, the clatter of rolling suitcases, snippets of conversations, and the occasional PA announcements echoing overhead. Among the crowd of travelers, Amelia Wright walked with a brisk pace, her neatly packed carry-on suitcase trailing behind her. Amelia was in her early 30s, a poised and confident flight attendant for Monarch Air, an airline known for its impeccable service and luxurious first-class experience. Dressed sharply in her navy blue uniform, her hair pulled into a sleek bun, she exuded professionalism. Today, however, she felt a slight tension in her chest. Something about the day felt off. At Gate 12, the Monarch Air flight crew was making final preparations for Flight 785 to New York City. The aircraft, a sleek, newly acquired model, gleamed under the morning sun. Amelia greeted her fellow crew members with warm nods as they exchanged quick updates about their assignments. She was tasked with overseeing first-class passengers, a position she typically enjoyed. First class was a realm of tailored suits, designer handbags, and the unspoken air of privilege. However, it was also where egos clashed and expectations were sky-high. Boarding began promptly at 9:30 a.m., starting with first-class passengers. Among the crowd making their way down the jet bridge, a man caught Amelia's attention. He wasn't dressed in the typical first-class attire of business suits or high-end casual wear. Instead, he wore simple yet well-fitted khaki pants and a light linen shirt, his leather duffel bag slung casually over his shoulder. He exuded a quiet confidence that stood out amidst the usual ostentation. Amelia noted his boarding pass. Seat 1A, first class. She allowed him to board without question, but couldn't shake the flicker of doubt that crossed her mind. He seemed out of place in this exclusive cabin. She mentally chastised herself for the thought. After all, she reminded herself, appearances could be deceiving. The cabin filled quickly with passengers settling into the plush leather seats. The man in 1A, later introduced as Marcus Gray, placed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled in with a relaxed demeanor. Across the aisle, a woman in a tailored white suit glanced at him, then quickly returned her attention to her phone, her expression unreadable. As Amelia moved through the pre-flight checks, she noticed Marcus watching the activity with an almost professional curiosity. He seemed to observe every detail, the way the flight attendants moved, how the overhead bins were secured, and even the rhythm of announcements over the intercom. Something about his demeanor unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Just before takeoff, a situation began brewing. Amelia returned to the cabin to find her junior colleague, Tara, engaged in a hushed but heated exchange with Marcus. Tara, a recent hire with a penchant for following rules to the letter, was adamant that there had been an error in seating assignments. "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong seat," Tara said, her tone firm yet polite. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unwavering. "This is my assigned seat. I booked it weeks ago," he replied, his voice steady but carrying an air of quiet authority. Amelia stepped in, trying to diffuse the situation. "Is there a problem here?" she asked Tara, who immediately turned to her for support. "He's insisting this is his seat," Tara explained, gesturing toward Marcus. But before Tara could finish, Marcus produced his boarding pass, clearly showing 1A and a first-class designation. Amelia felt a pang of embarrassment on behalf of her colleague. The evidence was indisputable. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," Amelia said, her tone conciliatory. "Please enjoy your flight." Marcus nodded, his expression revealing no trace of anger, though there was an unmistakable glint in his eye, a mixture of curiosity and quiet resolve. Amelia tried to shake off the incident as the plane taxied to the runway. However, her discomfort lingered. What was it about Marcus that felt so unusual? Why did Tara seem so convinced he didn't belong in first class? Amelia promised herself She would keep an eye on the situation, ensuring the rest of the flight was as smooth as possible. As the engines roared and the aircraft lifted into the skies, Amelia couldn't help but wonder if this seemingly ordinary passenger in Seat 1A was about to leave an extraordinary mark on their journey. Little did she know, the events that would unfold over the next few hours would challenge not just her professionalism, but also her understanding of respect, privilege, and the subtle ways people perceive one another. Unveiling the layers. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the fasten seatbelt sign had turned off with its familiar chime. The cabin eased into its usual rhythm, with passengers reclining their seats, flight attendants offering refreshments, and the low hum of the engines creating a soothing background. Amelia walked down the first-class aisle, her hand steady as she placed glasses of champagne on the trays of passengers. The morning's earlier incident with Marcus lingered in her mind, but she had resolved to focus on her duties. First-class passengers expected flawless service, and she prided herself on delivering it. Still, something about Marcus kept drawing her attention. Seated in 1A, Marcus had pulled out a slim laptop from his leather duffel bag and appeared engrossed in some work. His fingers moved deftly across the keyboard, occasionally pausing as he stared thoughtfully at the screen. There was an air of casual authority about him, a quiet confidence that Amelia found intriguing yet unsettling. "Would you like a drink, Mr. Gray?" Amelia asked, her voice carrying the polished professionalism she had perfected over the years. Marcus looked up, his expression softening. "Just water, please." Amelia nodded and handed him a chilled bottle of water and a glass. As she moved on to the next row, she overheard snippets of conversation between passengers. "That's not the usual type for first class," a woman whispered to her companion, a subtle glance in Marcus's direction betraying the subject of her comment. "Probably some tech guy who struck it rich," the man replied dismissively, chuckling softly. Amelia felt her cheeks flush. While she didn't condone such remarks, she couldn't deny that similar thoughts had crossed her mind earlier. She shook her head, frustrated with herself. Why should anyone's presence in first class be questioned based on appearance alone? As she moved toward the galley, Tara intercepted her, looking visibly flustered. "Amelia, can I talk to you for a second?" Amelia nodded, stepping into the small, private space near the galley. Tara glanced over her shoulder before speaking in a hushed tone. "About earlier with Mr. Gray. Do you think I handled it wrong?" Amelia sighed, softening her tone. "Tara, I think you meant well, but it's important to trust the process. If someone has a boarding pass for first class, it's not our place to question it unless there's a clear issue. We have to give everyone the benefit of the doubt." Tara bit her lip, nodding. "It's just, he didn't look like the usual type of passenger we get in first class, you know. I thought maybe there was a mistake." Amelia frowned but chose her words carefully. "Tara, our job isn't to decide who looks like they belong. Everyone deserves to be treated with the same level of respect and courtesy. Let this be a learning moment." Tara nodded again, looking chastened. "You're right. I'll do better." The conversation left Amelia feeling uneasy. She couldn't entirely blame Tara for her assumptions, given the implicit biases many people carried. But it was a stark reminder of how subtle and pervasive those biases could be, even in herself. Back in the cabin, Amelia noticed Marcus speaking with the older man in 2A, who introduced himself as Charles Harrington, a retired CEO. Their conversation, though quiet, carried an air of mutual respect. "So, Mr. Gray, what line of work are you in?" Charles asked, swirling his glass of whiskey. Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm in aviation, actually." Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "A pilot?" "Something like that," Marcus replied cryptically, his tone light but nonchalant. Their exchange caught Amelia's attention as she discreetly listened while arranging trays. Charles appeared to be genuinely curious, but Marcus skillfully redirected the conversation, asking Charles about his career instead. It was as though Marcus had perfected the art of deflecting attention from himself, a trait that only deepened Amelia's curiosity. Further down the cabin, a younger woman named Leela, dressed in athleisure and clutching a tablet, leaned toward Amelia as she passed. "Excuse me, miss, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Amelia replied, pausing by Leila's seat. "Is that guy in one as someone famous?" Leela whispered conspiratorially, her eyes darting toward Marcus. "He's got this vibe, you know, like he's someone important." Amelia smiled politely. "I couldn't say, ma'am, but if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." As the hours passed, Marcus continued to keep to himself, occasionally looking out the window or typing on his laptop. He declined the gourmet lunch offered to first-class passengers, opting instead for a simple cup of coffee. Amelia found herself wondering about his story. What kind of person chose simplicity over indulgence, especially when surrounded by luxury? Why did he seem so comfortable in his own skin yet uninterested in asserting his presence in this exclusive space? Her musings were interrupted by a small commotion in the economy cabin. The passenger had spilled a drink, and Amelia hurried to assist. As she helped clean up the mess, she overheard a group of passengers whispering about a special guest in first class. The rumors seemed to be spreading, though the details were muddled and exaggerated. When Amelia returned to the first-class cabin, Marcus caught her eye. "Everything okay back there?" he asked, his tone genuinely concerned. Amelia nodded. "Just a minor spill. Nothing to worry about." Marcus gave a small nod, then returned his attention to his laptop. For a moment, Amelia considered asking him directly about his background, but she decided against it. It wasn't her place, and besides, she valued the professional boundary between crew and passengers. As the flight neared its midpoint, the atmosphere in first class grew increasingly relaxed. Charles Harrington had fallen asleep, his blanket pulled up to his chin, while Leela was engrossed in a movie on her tablet. Marcus, however, remained an enigma, quietly observing, quietly working, quietly commanding attention without seeking it. In the galley, Amelia found herself reflecting on the day's events, the assumptions, the whispers, and Marcus's calm defiance of stereotypes all pointed to something deeper. This wasn't just a routine flight. It was a microcosm of society's biases, challenges, and unspoken rules. Amelia resolved to approach the rest of the flight with a renewed sense of fairness and empathy. Whether Marcus was a CEO, a pilot, or an ordinary traveler, he deserved the same respect as anyone else. She hoped that by the end of the journey, she could ensure every passenger felt valued, regardless of their background or appearance. What Amelia didn't yet realize was that the final hours of the flight would bring revelations and lessons she would carry with her long after they touched down in New York. Unmasking truths. The flight continued steadily at cruising altitude, and the early tension in the cabin seemed to dissipate, replaced by the gentle rhythm of in-flight activities. Passengers in first class settled into their routines, some enjoying gourmet meals, others engrossed in books, tablets, or quiet conversations. Yet the air still carried an undercurrent of curiosity, much of it directed toward Marcus in seat 1A. Amelia moved through the cabin with her usual poise, refilling drinks and attending to passengers' needs. Despite her best efforts to remain impartial, her gaze often drifted toward Marcus. He was an enigma, quiet yet confident, understated yet commanding. It wasn't just her. She could feel the other passengers grappling with the same questions about him. She was clearing plates when Charles Harrington, now awake and sipping another glass of whiskey, leaned toward her. "Amelia, isn't it?" he asked, glancing at her name tag. "Yes, Mr. Harrington. Can I assist you with something?" He gestured subtly toward Marcus. "That young man. Quite the intriguing fellow, don't you think?" Amelia hesitated, unsure how to respond. "He does seem reserved," she finally said, choosing her words carefully. Charles chuckled. "Reserved. That's putting it lightly. He's got the air of someone important, but doesn't flaunt it. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Amelia nodded politely and continued her duties, but Charles's words stayed with her. They echoed her own thoughts, and she suspected those of nearly everyone in first class. As the plane cruised over the Atlantic, Marcus stood and made his way toward the galley. Amelia watched as he walked with an easy, fluid confidence, his linen shirt slightly wrinkled but still looking effortlessly polished. He approached her with a small smile. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and polite. "Would it be possible to get another cup of coffee?" "Of course, Mr. Gray," Amelia replied, quickly preparing his drink. She handed it to him, and for a moment he lingered. "You have a well-run team," Marcus said, nodding toward the cabin. "Everyone seems efficient and attentive." Amelia felt a flicker of pride. "Thank you. We strive to provide the best experience for our passengers." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That shows. It's refreshing to see that kind of professionalism." As he returned to his seat, Amelia couldn't help but feel a small sense of validation. Compliments from passengers were common, but something about Marcus's words felt genuine, almost weighty. Back in his seat, Marcus opened his laptop again. But this time, a flight attendant from the economy section quietly approached Amelia in the galley. Her name tag read Sophie, and she was new to the crew. "Amelia," Sophie whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "There's some talk in the back about the man in 1A. Some passengers think he's, well, famous or something." Amelia sighed, setting down the tray she was holding. "Sophie, we don't entertain gossip. Every passenger deserves their privacy." Sophie nodded quickly, but her curiosity was palpable. "It's just, he doesn't act like a celebrity, but he's so composed. Even the crew is talking." Amelia frowned, feeling a twinge of frustration. She had worked hard to maintain professionalism, and the growing buzz around Marcus was becoming a distraction. Yet, deep down, she couldn't deny her own curiosity. As she returned to first class, she noticed that Marcus had put away his laptop and was now gazing out the window, his expression distant. She considered striking up a conversation, but before she could act, Charles Harrington leaned across the aisle. "Mr. Gray," Charles began, his tone amiable but probing, "you mentioned you're in aviation. Mind sharing a bit more about that? I find the field fascinating." Marcus turned, meeting Charles's gaze with a calm smile. "Aviation has been a big part of my life. I'm involved in operations and development." "Operations and development," Charles repeated, clearly intrigued. "That's quite broad. Do you work with one of the major airlines?" "You could say that," Marcus replied, his tone nonchalant. Amelia, standing nearby, couldn't help but admire how Marcus deflected questions with ease. He revealed just enough to satisfy curiosity without truly answering. It was a skill she recognized as rare and deliberate. Their conversation was interrupted by a slight turbulence, prompting Amelia to make an announcement reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. As she walked through the cabin to ensure compliance, she noticed Marcus had resumed his quiet contemplation, unfazed by the interruption. But the murmurs persisted. A younger couple in matching designer outfits whispered animatedly, occasionally glancing toward Marcus. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit typed on his phone, his movements suggesting he was searching for something, perhaps trying to identify Marcus based on the snippets of conversation he had overheard. The tension came to a head when Leela, a woman in athleisure, leaned across her seat to address Marcus directly. "Excuse me," she began, her tone hesitant but curious. "I hope I'm not bothering you, but you seem familiar. Have we met before?" Marcus looked at her, his expression neutral. "I don't believe so." Leela smiled apologetically. "I just thought, well, you carry yourself like someone who's used to being in charge." Marcus chuckled softly. "I suppose that's one way to put it." Before the conversation could continue, Amelia stepped in. "Ms. Leela, can I get you anything? Another drink, perhaps?" Leela glanced at Amelia and shook her head. "No, thank you. I was just curious." Amelia nodded, gently redirecting the conversation. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." As the flight neared its final hours, the energy in the cabin shifted. The initial intrigue surrounding Marcus began to settle, replaced by a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. Marcus, for his part, remained composed and unbothered, his demeanor suggesting he was used to such scrutiny. In the galley, Amelia found herself reflecting on the day's events. The whispers, the assumptions, and the subtle dynamics of power and perception at play in first class had laid bare the biases and preconceptions many people carried. She couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's presence on this flight was more than coincidence. It felt like a quiet challenge to the status quo. As the plane began its descent into New York, Amelia resolved to approach the rest of the journey with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever Marcus's story was, it had left an indelible mark on the crew and passengers alike. And the journey wasn't over yet. A ripple in the skies. The plane began its gradual descent, the skyline of New York City visible in the distance through breaks in the clouds. First-class passengers adjusted their seats, some tidying up their belongings while others stared out the window, lost in thought. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a familiar and calming background to the journey's final moments. Amelia took her usual position near the front of the cabin, ready to address any last-minute passenger requests. Her earlier determination to remain impartial was tested yet again when Marcus rose from his seat, walking with deliberate steps toward the galley. His casual demeanor seemed to carry more weight now, as though he were not merely a passenger but someone silently observing, assessing. "Excuse me," Marcus said softly as he approached Amelia. "I'd like to thank you for your attentiveness during this flight." Amelia blinked, slightly taken aback by his directness. "Thank you, Mr. Gray. It's my pleasure to ensure all passengers have a comfortable journey." Marcus smiled faintly, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "I imagine it's not always easy, especially when you're dealing with unique situations." Amelia's professionalism wavered for a moment as she registered his words. "We strive to handle all situations with grace," she replied carefully. Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "I appreciate that. You've handled everything with poise, even when the environment around you made it challenging." Amelia wasn't sure how to respond. His words carried a depth that hinted at more than just a polite acknowledgement. Before she could reply, Marcus stepped back to his seat, leaving her with a mix of curiosity and a hint of unease. Meanwhile, the energy in first class was shifting once again. Passengers who had remained aloof during the earlier parts of the flight now found themselves drawn into hushed conversations. Charles Harrington, who had been observing Marcus with a keen eye, leaned toward Leela. "Do you notice it?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. "Notice what?" Leela replied, glancing briefly toward Marcus. "The way he carries himself. He doesn't flaunt anything, but it's clear he's someone who's seen it all. There's a certain gravity to him." Leela nodded slowly, her curiosity piqued. "He's different, that's for sure." In the row behind them, Nathan, a tech executive who had been quietly working on his laptop for most of the flight, closed his device and chimed in. "I think he's deliberately keeping us guessing. People like him don't stay under the radar by accident." Charles chuckled. "True, but it's not just his demeanor. Did you notice how he handled that situation with the younger flight attendant? Most people would have escalated. He diffused it without a word of anger." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Laura, the senior flight attendant, approached Marcus's seat with a tentative smile. "Mr. Gray," she began, her tone respectful yet cautious, "would you mind joining me in the galley for a moment?" Marcus glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Of course." As he rose and followed Laura to the galley, Amelia felt her heart race slightly. She watched as the two engaged in a quiet but intense conversation. Marcus's face remained calm, his responses measured, while Laura's demeanor shifted between apology and attentiveness. When Marcus returned to his seat, Amelia caught a glimpse of something she hadn't seen before, a flicker of weariness. It was subtle, but in that moment, he looked less like the composed enigma, and more like a man carrying an invisible weight. The descent into New York continued, and the cabin crew began preparing for landing. Amelia moved methodically, her years of experience allowing her to balance professionalism with an acute awareness of her surroundings. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, especially those who had taken an interest in Marcus. As she secured the galley, Amelia found herself reflecting on her interactions with Marcus throughout the flight. He had deflected questions with grace, maintained his composure under scrutiny, and treated everyone, from fellow passengers to the crew, with a quiet respect. Yet his presence had created ripples, exposing biases and assumptions that often went unnoticed. Tara approached her, holding a tray of empty glasses. "Amelia, do you think he's someone important? Like, really important?" Amelia sighed, setting down the coffee pot she had been holding. "Tara, everyone on this plane is important. Whether they're in first class or economy, they deserve the same level of respect." Tara nodded but didn't look convinced. "It's just, he's different. People are talking." Amelia placed a hand on Tara's shoulder. "And that's part of the problem. We're so focused on figuring out who someone is based on appearances or assumptions that we forget to simply treat them as equals." Tara looked thoughtful, and for the first time that day, Amelia saw a glimmer of understanding in her colleague's eyes. As the plane descended further, the view of New York grew clearer. The iconic skyline stretched out before them, a symbol of ambition and resilience. Amelia made her final rounds, checking seat belts and tray tables. When she reached Marcus, he looked up, offering a faint smile. "Thank you for your hospitality, Ms. Wright," he said. Amelia paused, surprised that he had remembered her name. "It's been a pleasure having you on board, Mr. Gray." Marcus's smile deepened slightly. "I'm sure today hasn't been easy, but you've handled it with grace." Amelia nodded, unsure how to respond. As she moved to the next row, she felt a strange sense of closure, as though this flight had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone involved. The wheels touched down smoothly at JFK Airport, and the plane taxied toward the gate. The usual flurry of activity began as passengers retrieved their belongings and prepared to disembark. Marcus remained seated, waiting patiently as others filed out. Amelia stood near the exit, bidding each passenger farewell. When Marcus finally approached, he paused for a moment, meeting her gaze. "Ms. Wright," he said, his tone quiet but firm, "you're very good at what you do. Keep that up." Before she could respond, he stepped off the plane, disappearing into the crowded terminal. Amelia watched him go, a mix of emotions swirling within her. As the rest of the crew joined her in tidying up the cabin, Laura approached. "Amelia," she said softly, "I found out who he is." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "And?" Laura hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Let's just say, he's the kind of person who could teach us all a thing or two about flying and life." Amelia didn't press for more details. She didn't need to. Marcus Gray had already left an indelible mark on her, her crew, and every passenger he had encountered. Whatever his story was, she knew it would stay with her long after the flight. The unseen impact. The plane emptied, leaving behind the echo of departing footsteps and the faint aroma of coffee and breakfast trays. The cabin crew worked swiftly, collecting abandoned blankets and headphones, resetting the space for the next flight. The energy in the air was different now, subdued yet charged with an unspoken tension. Amelia found herself lingering near the galley, her thoughts orbiting around Marcus Gray. Though she prided herself on her professionalism, she couldn't deny the impact he had left on her and the entire flight. From the subtle shifts in passenger conversations to the way her junior colleague Tara now carried herself, the ripple effect of his quiet presence was undeniable. Laura joined Amelia near the galley, her face a mixture of exhaustion and contemplation. "You did well today," Laura said, breaking the silence. Amelia glanced at her senior colleague. "Thank you, Laura. But I can't shake the feeling that we all learned something important today." Laura chuckled softly. "If you're talking about Marcus Gray, you're not the only one." I had a quick word with the ground crew. Turns out he's more than just a frequent flyer. Amelia tilted her head, intrigued. More than a frequent flyer? What do you mean? Laura leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. He's one of the key figures behind Skybridge Aviation, a company revolutionizing aviation sustainability and safety standards. Not just that, he's one of their founding members. He's practically rewriting how we think about flying. Amelia's eyes widened in surprise. She had heard of Skybridge Aviation. The company was renowned for its cutting-edge technology and initiatives aimed at making air travel more efficient and environmentally friendly. Their leadership was often in the news, but Marcus Gray's name had never come up in her research. Why would someone like that fly so under the radar? Amelia wondered aloud. Laura shrugged. Some people don't need the spotlight. They let their work speak for itself. Amelia nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Marcus's reserved demeanor, his interest in the crew's operations, even his calm response to Tara's assumptions, it all pointed to someone deeply invested in understanding the human and operational aspects of flying. By the time Amelia exited the aircraft, the terminal was alive with activity. Passengers from their flight were scattered across the gate area, some reconnecting with family, others rushing to their next destination. Amelia spotted Marcus near a coffee kiosk, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he waited for his order. For a moment, she debated approaching him. It wasn't something she typically did, but this flight had been far from typical. Summoning her courage, she crossed the terminal and approached Marcus. "Mr. Gray," she began hesitantly. He turned, his expression neutral but warm. "Ms. Wright," he said with a small nod. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I just wanted to thank you," Amelia said, choosing her words carefully. "Not just for your kind words on the flight, but for the way you handled everything. You could have made things much harder for us, but you didn't." Marcus smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "I've learned that reacting with anger rarely leads to progress. Besides, you and your team showed genuine professionalism. That's worth appreciating." Amelia hesitated before continuing. "Laura mentioned your work with Skybridge Aviation. It sounds like you're doing incredible things." Marcus's smile deepened slightly, but he remained humble. "It's a team effort. I'm just one part of it." "I've heard about your initiatives," Amelia said. "It's inspiring to know someone so committed to making aviation better." Marcus's expression softened. "Thank you. It's a passion of mine. But what you and your crew do every day is just as important. You're the face of the industry, the ones who shape passengers' experiences. That matters." Amelia felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "It's not often we get passengers who recognize that." "Maybe it's because I've seen both sides," Marcus replied. "Being in this industry has taught me how interconnected everything is. A small act of kindness, or unkindness, can ripple through an entire flight." As his coffee order was called, Marcus picked up the cup and turned back to Amelia. "Keep doing what you're doing, Ms. Wright. You're making a bigger difference than you realize." Before she could respond, Marcus offered her a parting nod and disappeared into the sea of travelers. Amelia stood there for a moment, replaying his words in her mind. They carried a weight she hadn't expected, a validation of her efforts that felt deeply personal. Back at the crew lounge, Amelia joined her colleagues as they debriefed the flight. Tara was unusually quiet, her expression thoughtful as she sipped on a bottle of water. Laura, ever the seasoned leader, guided the conversation with a mix of humor and reflection. "Let's talk about today's lessons," Laura said, her tone light but firm. "Tara, care to share your thoughts?" Tara glanced up, her cheeks flushing slightly. I think I learned that assumptions can be dangerous. I made a mistake with Mr. Gray, and it's something I won't forget." Laura nodded approvingly. "Good. We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. The important thing is recognizing them and doing better." Amelia added, "And remembering that every passenger deserves respect, regardless of their appearance or background." The crew exchanged nods of agreement, the atmosphere in the lounge growing lighter. Yet, beneath the surface, Amelia sensed that the day's events had left a lasting impression on all of them. That evening, as Amelia sat in her apartment overlooking the city, she reflected on the flight. Marcus Gray had been more than just a passenger. He had been a catalyst, a quiet force challenging everyone around him to reevaluate their assumptions and actions. She opened her laptop and began drafting a letter, a thank you note to the anonymous passenger who had unknowingly inspired her to approach her job with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't expect to send it, but the act of writing felt cathartic. Dear Mr. Gray, thank you for reminding me that every encounter holds the potential for growth. You showed me the power of quiet resilience and the importance of treating every individual with dignity. I hope our paths cross again. Until then, I'll carry the lessons of today forward. As she hit save, Amelia smiled to herself. She couldn't predict the future, but she knew this. Marcus Gray had left an indelible mark on her journey, and she was determined to pay it forward. A new horizon. The sun dipped below the horizon as Amelia prepared for her next flight. The terminal buzzed with the usual energy, but tonight felt different. Something about the previous day's encounter with Marcus Gray lingered, reshaping her perspective on her role and her place in the broader tapestry of aviation. Amelia tightened her ponytail, adjusted her uniform, and made her way to the crew briefing room. Laura was already there, reviewing the flight plan with the other attendants. Tara sat off to the side, her expression more resolute than Amelia had ever seen. "You're early," Laura said with a smile as Amelia walked in. "Wanted to get a head start," Amelia replied, taking the seat. "I've been thinking about yesterday." Laura nodded knowingly. "It's hard not to, isn't it? Passengers like Marcus don't come along often." Tara chimed in, her voice steadier than usual. "I spent last night reading about Skybridge Aviation. The work they're doing is groundbreaking, and to think I almost wrote him off because of how he looked." Amelia placed a reassuring hand on Tara's shoulder. "What matters is that you've learned from it. That's how we grow." Laura stood, clapping her hands lightly to gather the team's attention. "All right, crew. Let's make today's flight even better than yesterday. We got a full cabin, including a few VIPs, so stay sharp." As they prepared to board the aircraft, Amelia couldn't help but carry Marcus's words with her. Every interaction matters. Every choice ripples outward. The flight to Los Angeles began smoothly. First-class passengers were welcomed aboard with the usual fanfare, champagne flutes, warm towels, and personalized greetings. Amelia noticed Tara handling her duties with extra care, her voice warmer, her smiles more genuine. It was a subtle transformation, but one Amelia found inspiring. In the economy cabin, Sophie was assisting a young mother struggling with a crying toddler. Amelia stepped in to help, her tone gentle and reassuring. "Take your time," she said, helping the mother secure her belongings while distracting the child with a playful smile. It was a small act, but it earned a grateful nod from the mother, a reminder that kindness often went unnoticed, but never unappreciated. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, Amelia took a moment to glance at the passenger list. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but one caught her eye. Michael Whittaker. It wasn't the same Michael from Marcus's flight, but the coincidence made her smile. The name felt like a small reminder of the connections and conversations that had made the previous flight so memorable. Midway through the flight, Amelia encountered a woman seated in first class who looked particularly uneasy. Her hands clutched the armrests tightly, and her breathing was shallow. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Amelia asked, crouching slightly to meet the woman's gaze. The woman shook her head. "I hate flying. My husband usually handles this part, but he couldn't make it today." Amelia smiled gently. "It's perfectly normal to feel that way. Would it help if I stayed with you for a moment?" The woman nodded, her grip on the armrest relaxing slightly as Amelia sat beside her and struck up a conversation. She asked about the woman's destination, her family, her hobbies, anything to shift the focus from the flight. Gradually, the woman's breathing steadied, and the tension in her shoulders eased. "Thank you," the woman said after a while. "You didn't have to do that." "It's my pleasure," Amelia replied. "Flying can be stressful, but we're here to make it as comfortable as possible." As Amelia returned to the galley, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in a long time. The exchange reminded her why she had chosen this career in the first place, not for the glamour or the perks, but for the opportunity to connect with people in meaningful ways. The flight neared its final hour, and Amelia began her routine checks. As she moved through the first-class cabin, a man in his late 40s stopped her. "You're very good at what you do," he said, his tone thoughtful. "I've flown hundreds of times, and I don't think I've ever seen someone handle passengers as well as you do." Amelia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you. That means a lot. Have you ever considered moving up in the airline?" The man continued. "Management, training, something beyond the cabin." The question caught Amelia off guard. "I haven't, actually. I've always loved being in the cabin, interacting with passengers." The man nodded. "Just something to think about. People like you have the potential to make a bigger impact." Amelia thanked him and continued her rounds, her mind buzzing with possibilities she hadn't considered before. Could she make a broader impact? Could her passion for people translate into something greater within the airline? As the plane descended into Los Angeles, the cabin grew quiet, passengers absorbed in their own preparations. Amelia felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to embracing each interaction as an opportunity to make a difference. After the passengers disembarked, Amelia joined her crew in the terminal. Laura approached her, a knowing look in her eyes. "Something tells me you're thinking about the future," Laura said. Amelia smiled. "I think I am. Yesterday reminded me that this job is about more than just service. It's about connection. And maybe there's a way to bring that to a larger scale." Laura nodded approvingly. "Whatever path you choose, Amelia, I know you'll excel. You've got the heart for it." As Amelia walked through the terminal, the California sun streaming through the windows, she felt a sense of clarity. Marcus Gray had shown her the power of quiet influence, of leading by example. Now, it was her turn to carry that lesson forward, to create her own ripple in the vast skies of aviation. And as she looked ahead to her next journey, she knew it would be just the beginning. A new path. The Los Angeles terminal buzzed with activity as Amelia stepped out into the crisp evening air. She could feel the weight of the day, not from exhaustion but from the magnitude of her thoughts. The conversation with Laura, Tara's transformation, and the lingering impact of Marcus Gray all blended into a symphony of realization. Her role as a flight attendant was more than a job. It was a platform. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of flights and layovers, but Amelia carried herself differently. Each interaction, from helping a nervous flyer to chatting with her crew, felt imbued with a renewed sense of purpose. She began to notice things she hadn't before. Subtle gestures of gratitude from passengers, the unspoken camaraderie among her colleagues, and the power of small, kind words to diffuse tense moments. During one layover in San Francisco, Amelia found herself with unexpected downtime. She decided to explore an aviation museum near her hotel. Wandering through exhibits showcasing the history and evolution of flight, she felt a deep connection to the industry she had dedicated her life to. A small display caught her eye, an exhibit on Skybridge Aviation's innovations in sustainability. Among the plaques was a mention of Marcus Gray as one of the company's founding visionaries. Standing there, Amelia realized that Marcus's humility was as impactful as his achievements. He didn't boast or draw attention to himself, yet his work and presence spoke volumes. She reflected on her own journey. Could she embody the same quiet strength and make a difference in her own way? A week later, Amelia's airline held an internal workshop for its crew, focusing on customer experience and leadership development. To her surprise, Laura had recommended her as a speaker. Nervous but excited, Amelia prepared to share her insights with her peers. Standing at the front of the conference room, Amelia felt the eyes of dozens of crew members on her. She took a deep breath and began. "Flying is more than getting passengers from point A to point B," she said, her voice steady. "It's about connection. Every person on board has a story, a reason for being there, and a unique perspective. Our job isn't just to serve, it's to see them, to make them feel valued." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I learned this lesson recently from a passenger who reminded me of the power of kindness and quiet resilience. He didn't demand respect. He earned it through his actions. And it made me realize that we, as crew members, have the same opportunity on every flight." The room was silent, but Amelia could feel the energy shift. She saw nods of agreement, the kind of understanding that goes beyond words. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Laura approached her afterward, beaming. "That was incredible. Amelia, you've got a gift." Amelia smiled. "I just spoke from the heart." Months passed, and Amelia's life took on a new rhythm. Inspired by Marcus Gray and her experiences, she began pursuing opportunities to make a broader impact within the airline. She volunteered for diversity and inclusion initiatives, joined a team focused on improving passenger experience, and mentored new crew members like Tara. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. During an annual company meeting, Amelia was recognized for her contributions to fostering a culture of respect and empathy. The CEO of the airline even mentioned her work as an example of leadership in action. As she accepted the award, Amelia thought of Marcus Gray. She had never reached out to him after their encounter, but his influence had rippled through her life in ways he might never know. One evening, after a long but fulfilling flight, Amelia received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "A ripple effect." Curious, she opened it. "Dear Ms. Wright, I hope this message finds you well. I recently heard from one of your colleagues about the impact you've been making within your airline. It brought me great joy to see how our brief encounter may have contributed to your journey. You once thanked me for showing kindness and restraint, but I want to thank you for embracing those values and spreading them to others. This industry needs people like you, people who see the humanity in every passenger and crew member. Keep leading with grace. The skies are brighter because of it. Warm regards, Marcus Gray." Amelia read the email twice, her heart swelling with gratitude. Marcus's words reaffirmed everything she had come to believe about her role. She crafted a heartfelt reply, expressing her thanks and promising to continue building on the lessons she had learned. As she hit send, she looked out the window of her apartment at the twinkling city lights below. The world was vast, filled with countless stories and connections waiting to be made, and she was ready to embrace them, one flight at a time. Amelia smiled, knowing her journey was far from over. The skies stretched endlessly before her, and with each takeoff, she carried a renewed sense of purpose, inspired by the quiet strength of a passenger who had shown her the power of a ripple in the skies.